My name's Tim Kenny from Tim Kenny Surveying, and you're probably going to have to excuse this video. This is probably where I'm going to get overexcited because I'm going to talk about one of my favourite areas of buildings. This is the area where I get the most excited. But I'm a surveyor. It shows that I'm in the right job. These things about buildings do really kind of I enjoy it, and I think it's a really fascinating area. And hopefully, some of you are. If you're watching this, you're probably, you know, familiar enough with getting overexcited about certain bits of buildings and defects and what have you. So, anyway, this week I'm going to talk about suspended timber floors. I'm going to explain why I think these are the most interesting area of any building. I'm going to explain why I think they're perhaps poorly understood, but I'm also going to explain why it doesn't matter. This is why I'm going to say this is a really self-indulgent video. I'm going to explain a load of stuff that actually, you know what, if you didn't know, probably not going to matter. So, suspended timber floors. This is where we obviously have traditional form of construction. Makes up a reasonable portion of your traditionally constructed buildings. Flooring, ground floor. Fundamentally, we're talking about, this is where you have obviously timber joists bedded usually into the wall, overlaid with floorboards, and then a gap. Right, that's your suspended timber floor. And I know when I was taught about it, and when you were taught about it, you were probably given this really nice story about cross-flow of ventilation. Right? Weren't you? You're told that it has to be air bricks at the front and air bricks at the back, or two sides, whatever the setup is, and air blows through that, and it blows out all the moisture that can develop. Because obviously these floors, air gap, just ground underneath it, water evaporates from the ground, collects in the space. If you don't ventilate that in some way, you're going to get a risk of rot to the floor joists, floorboards. You've also got a risk of damp in the walls. So we think, okay, we have this cross-flow ventilation, blows all the air in and it blows the moisture out the other side. You probably showed nice little diagrams of, like, you have an arrow coming in and it shows it going across, maybe put through the sleeper walls and then out through the other side, right? And that's a really useful narrative, right? It's also probably not true in most cases, right? We have this idea that that's how all timber floors are intended to stay dry, right? And it's true that some of them probably do. Some of them probably work in exactly that way. But my view, my sense, is that's actually quite a small minority, right? Because we've really got to start to kind of, if we start to think about it clearly, we start to really examine that narrative, it actually will stop making sense, right? So we think that air blows in and blows through to the outside, through the air bricks, right? And of course, where are air bricks? Well, they're right down on the ground, aren't they? Below floor level. If they were above floor level, then they're not going to be ventilating the cavity, which is a different issue in itself. But they'll be below floor level, nice and low to the ground, where they can easily get blocked up, which again is a different issue. But they're on the ground, right? How much air is actually moving at ground level in most cases, in most buildings, right? Because what are we going to have around it? Well, most buildings have some form of boundary structure. If we think about our typical, for example, Victorian terrace property, they're going to have a boundary wall and probably, that much front garden, and then you're straight into the house, right? Air does not kind of come in and drop down and push through. It really doesn't. It just pushes past, right? So the idea that the air is blowing in is a little bit iffy when you start to examine it from those grounds, right? And I kind of tested this myself. I was at a property a couple of years ago. I'm based on the coast, and this one was really down by the sea. Not, maybe 200-300 meters from the sea, not far at all. And they're on quite a windy day. And for some reason, the floorboard was up, and I was having to look under the floor for various things. And you know what? No air moving at all. Right? Wind was blowing a lot, and there was no sense of air movement within that void, because, of course, the air bricks were relatively sheltered, right? As it happened, there wasn't any damp. The issue I was looking at was not related to a damp issue, particularly to do with that. So that lack of movement wasn't a problem. It wasn't happening, but it wasn't a problem. So then this kind of leads us on to, okay, well, how is it staying dry? What actually is more likely to be happening? And in my view, and again, I'm going to say none of this is tested, because you know what, no one's going to pay for the sort of research project I would like to organise in relation to testing air movement under timber floors. as I said, probably doesn't matter anyway. So we're never going to be able to test these things. But these are just some of the theories that I have, and I think they're interesting and useful. And if you've got your own ideas, then please do share them. Um, the first thing I think actually is that one of the ways that moisture is leaving suspended timber floors, and it is definitely happening in most cases, is still through the air bricks. But I think what is more likely than air blowing in and pushing through is air actually cutting across, right? If we think about air movement across an air gap, that's going to pull air out with it. So instead of blowing the air out, the wind as it goes past is going to pull the air out. And obviously, as it pulls the air out, it pulls the moisture with it. And that can be happening both sides. It can be happening on one side and not happening on the other, or different wind conditions. It'll happen differently. That's one distinct possibility. Another distinct possibility is different pressure levels. Right, the pressure outside of a building, and certainly the pressure outside of a building from a suspended timber floor, is going to be a pressure differential. And as we know, air tries to kind of equalize that. So air will be pulled out by the difference in pressure. I mean, that wind is creating a pressure difference, but there'll be a natural pressure difference as well. And again, that will pull the air out. And again, both sides or just one side. And therefore will help kind of keep that moisture out and will help keep that surface dry. That void dry. Another mechanism I think is going to happen is that constant interchange of air at the air bricks. Okay, so again, the kind of because of physics, basically, moisture molecules are going to be interchanging at that point. They're going to be transferring from one air molecule to another, so it's just going to keep dropping off little bits of moisture. Not a lot, but it's happening 24 hours a day, 365 days a year at every air brick. And again, that will be helping to keep moisture levels lower than they would be otherwise. Another way I think it is probably leaving that space is it's probably coming up. So it could well be that wind is blowing in, depending on the orientation and any kind of sheltering, and it will then push the air up. And any gaps within that floor, and obviously if it's a timber floor, there will be gaps no matter what we do, and therefore that will take moisture with it, and obviously then it'll rise up out into the habitable spaces where it'll be ventilated in other ways. Okay, so for me, these are probably the more likely mechanisms for removal of moisture from a suspended timber floor. But why I say it doesn't matter is because all of it needs an air brick, right? Whether it is wind blowing across, whether it is pressure differential, whether it is the interchange of air, or whether it is air blowing in and pushing up, all of those need air bricks. If we don't have them, we've got a problem. If they're blocked, we've got a problem. If they're only going into one side and they're not going all the way through to the subfloor void, we've got a problem, right? So these things are all really interesting, and I find it fascinating, and I get overexcited about it. If you've done any kind of training with me, I've probably found a reason to talk about it because I think it is really interesting. But it doesn't matter. That's what's great about it. As long as you've got air bricks, and again, as a good competent surveyor, you should be checking that there are air bricks present. It personally makes me a little bit less concerned by the kind of idea, okay, well, I've got air bricks on that bit and that bit, but they put an extension at the back and it's blocked them up. I'd still be mindful of that, certainly, but maybe it kind of down pushes down my concerns about it, but it's still something really to think about. Generally speaking, I'm more concerned about kind of the, particularly we've kind of extended on our traditional buildings and the interaction of a solid floor with what used to be an external wall. I'd be always much more concerned and mindful of that than I would be about this cross-flow ventilation under the floor. But as I say, we still need to have air bricks. We still need to make sure they're clear. We still make sure everything is free flowing because that is what is required. But as I said, I think it's really interesting. I throw this in as an example of what we have to think about, what we can think about, what is interesting, what is fascinating about our buildings. Even these little bits that we think we understand, actually, you know what? Probably going to be a lot more complicated than that basic level understanding that we all put out. And I think this really, for me, talks to this idea of qualification versus competence, right? Qualification will tell you that, air blows in and pushes it out, and we were all told that, in any kind of training that we've done. Competence and learnt experience tells you to start to question that, start to have a better understanding of actually what's going on. Don't just take the information you're given and say, you know what, that's gospel. I'm going to just live with that uh, forevermore. Start to question it, start to think about it, start to apply it, start to look at the buildings you're working on, you're inspecting, and say, you know what, does that theory that I was told 10 years ago in that one webinar, or 6 months ago in that CPD session that I did, does this actually fit in this situation? Question it, understand it, and once you do that, you start to realize how fascinating, complicated, confounding our buildings can be. Anyway, that was just my little self-indulgent kind of ramble on suspended timber floors. If you've got different thoughts, if you want to suggest any different ways you think suspended timber floors maybe staying dry, if you want if you want to talk about insulation of suspended timber floors, which is perhaps I shouldn't even mention that because I'll get myself onto another convoluted conversation on that, and that really does tie into issues around understanding. Then please do welcome your thoughts. It is something I'm always happy to talk about. Thank you very much.